It's good to celebrate. Always a lot of fun to celebrate. Sometimes we celebrate the birth of a child. Sometimes we celebrate maybe a promotion at work. Sometimes we celebrate just because. And I think that out of all those celebrations, that's kind of my most favorite type of celebration. It's just because, we get together and we just have fun and we celebrate life itself just because, we can. And celebrations are always fun. And whenever you're invited to one, if you can go, you should. But unfortunately, some people just don't feel that way. And in Luke chapter 14, verses 15 through 21, Jesus tells a parable about such an occasion. A celebration was going to happen and being held, and some people just rejected the invitation. See, in ancient Palestine, when you were going to have a feast or a banquet, the way that it worked was you would tell people the day of the banquet or the feast, but not a specific time. This was very important because you didn't want people getting there hours and hours and hours and hours ahead of time, because, the food cooking preparations and so forth weren't as sophisticated as they are today. And also, and not to mention watches, they weren't quite as accurate as they are today. So, you would tell them the day, but not the exact time. When the feast was ready, the host of the banquet would send a messenger to let everybody who had been invited know that the feast was ready and the time and hour for the celebration had arrived. Well, Jesus is in the home of a Pharisee at a banquet of sorts, at a feast, we might say. Now, the thing is that just about every time Jesus is invited to the home of a Pharisee, there's always ulterior motives. And that's the case here. In fact, verse 1 of chapter 14 makes it very clear that it was a trap that the Pharisees were laying for Jesus. I mean, they put a guy who is very sick and very ill right in front of Jesus on the Sabbath day. I mean, what's Jesus going to do? Duh! He's going to heal him on the Sabbath day, and that's going to give them reasons to dislike Jesus even more. Well, follow along as I read Luke 14, verses 15 through 24. When one of those who reclined at table with him heard these things, he said to him, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." But he said to him, "A man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I've bought a field, and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused.' And another said, 'I bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Please have me excused.' And another said, 'I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come.' So the servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city and bring the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame.' And the servant said, 'Sir, what you have commanded has been done, and still there is room.' And the master said to the servant, 'Go out into the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet.'" Several things we need to look at as we explore the parable of the great banquet. One of those would be to look at the guests. When you're going to have a party, a celebration, a banquet, whatever you want to call it, a feast, your guest list is very important. And so the guests for this banquet, first let's look at those who were invited to the celebration. They represent the Jews, okay? They represent the Jewish nation. More honored guests when you had a celebration or a feast would be summoned personally. You would send, it'd be kind of like if you were the guest of honor at a banquet or something like that. Nowadays, someone that's planning the banquet might say, "Well, we'll send a car to pick you up." or we'll send somebody by to pick you up to make sure that, you get there with as little stress and as easily as possible. Well, the Jews were the chosen people of God. The Jews had the car sent for them. All they needed to do was get in and go to the banquet. They had that upper hand, we might say. In fact, the entire reason the Jewish nation was a nation is because of the coming of the Messiah. That's it. That was why. Back in Genesis, when God calls Abraham, how many kids did Abraham and Sarah have? None. Okay? And yet God says, I'm going to build a nation out of you. He didn't have any kids. Even he was 100 years old. Sarah was 90 years old. They didn't have kids, and yet then Isaac is born. And so their entire reason for existing as a nation was so that the Messiah could come. So these more honored guests, they would be summoned personally. The Jews were just like that. They had every advantage given to them. Then the other guests would divide themselves into two classes. Okay, first would be those who didn't think very highly of themselves. These would be those who would arrive early for the celebration, grateful for the invitation. As soon as, I said the more honored guests would be summoned personally. The others might be like a town crier sort of thing, where they would go out and say, the banquet is now ready. If you were invited, come on, and everything. And those who didn't think highly of themselves would get there early, grateful for the opportunity to share in the feast, maybe even willing to ask and say, is there anything I can do to help out? Then on the other side of that coin were those who did think highly of themselves. Those who did think highly of themselves, they would either arrive right on time or maybe a little bit late. Stylishly late, as we sometimes call it, so that you make a big entrance. The first place that I preached at professionally or full-time was a little metal building, and the building didn't have a foyer. So when you opened up the doors to the outside, you were in the auditorium. Now, many, many times in my 5 years there, people would get there just a little bit late, a little bit after Bible class started, a little bit after church worship services started. And when they came in the door, the sunlight from outside came into the building, and everybody turned around to see who it was. It's an involuntary reaction, I think. But it's just, they weren't trying to make a big entrance or be noticed as they entered, but, it just so happened that way. Well, these who thought more highly of themselves perhaps than they should have, they would get there so that they could make a big entrance and be noticed when they got there. So those were those guests that were invited to a banquet. We also have those who were stand-ins, those others, we might say. The streets and lanes of the city, some have alleyways. These are the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame. Now, you might say, well, who might those represent? Well, perhaps those people represent the Jewish quote-unquote sinners, such as the ones who found in Jesus a welcoming friend, such as tax collectors and the other social outcasts that would be attracted to Jesus, that would actually listen to what Jesus says and then try and do it for themselves. And then the other stand-ins were the highways and hedges people. These were some versions have country roads and lanes. These would be places outside of the city. Now, this is significant because, well, these might represent the Gentiles to whom the kingdom of God was miraculously opened up. They weren't in that inner circle. They weren't in the city, say, of Jerusalem. They were from outside the Jewish nation. And yet the kingdom of God was somehow opened up to them, and they were able to join and be a part of that celebration that was in the kingdom of God. Speaking of that celebration, we come to the banquet of the parable. You see, the Jewish belief was that when the Messiah came, there would be a big party. Big banquet, big celebration, and lots of food and lots of feasting and everything. It was a great celebration is what they were expecting and anticipating. I think knowing this kind of sort of explains verse 15. Because if you didn't know that, then you read, well, when one of those who reclined at table with him heard these things, he said to him, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Well, that just seems sort of like a random statement. I mean, blessed are those who eat in the bread in the kingdom of God. What's that all about? Especially to our 21st century ears. Seems like something odd to say just sort of out of the blue. But context and commentaries can always help us when we're a little bit fuzzy on what something might mean. This belief, though, was talking about a physical feast. They actually thought that the Messiah would come and they would have a physical feast of food and everything physical. Now, how this all plays into the proper context here, verses 1 through 14 of Luke 14, Jesus gives some pretty difficult teachings. Okay, again, it starts with a man healing a man with dropsy, which is a swelling of soft tissue, possibly due to retaining water or other possible medical forms that they didn't know about in the first century, okay? Nowadays they say, well, it's partially maybe due to congestive heart failure and things of that nature. But the man is brought before Jesus on the Sabbath day. He heals him. That's in verses 1 through 6. In verses 7 through 11, Jesus talks to the others who are at the feast with him. And he talks to them about not just walking in and taking the most honored place, but to take the lowest place so that the host could bring them up and honor them in front of everybody else. See, the way it worked at a feast was the host sat at the head of the table. The most important guest sat to the host's right. The second most important guest sat to the host's left. The third most sat in the second chair on the host's right, and so on and so forth. And so that's how they determined the order of importance of the guests. Well, Jesus says when you go to a banquet, don't start up at the top, start at the bottom. That's in verses 7 through 11. And then in verses 12 through 14, Jesus turns his attention from those who are invited to those who do the inviting. You know, a lot of times social butterflies, we might call them, you know, they invite somebody to their home, then that person invites them back, and they go back and forth. Or maybe there's 3 or 4 couples or families, and they just sort of circulate, and everybody invites everybody else, and it's all just one great big happy little circle of society. Well, Jesus says, don't invite the people who are going to invite you back. When you have a feast, invite people who can't invite you back. Like the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Does that at all sound familiar to the parable? You know, see, so, and then verses 15 through 24 is a continuation of this discussion. You know, Jesus is at a feast. He's talked to the people who were invited with him. He's talked to the people who did the inviting. And now this guy brings up, well, the feast in the kingdom of God. So Jesus plays on this Jewish belief about the kingdom of God being ushered in with a great feast. Jesus uses what the people will understand. And this isn't the only time that he does it. He does it very frequently. In fact, in nearly all of his parables, he uses things that the people would understand, that they could identify with. And so he compares the kingdom with a feast. How does the kingdom compare with a feast? Well, think about it. A feast is an occasion of great joy and of celebration. The kingdom ought to be a time of great joy and celebration. See, the charge leveled by those who reject Christianity and that they level against Christianity is that it takes all of the light, all of the zest, all of the zeal, all of the joy out of life. People would say, well, Christianity is just a bunch of thou shalt nots. You can't do this and you can't do that. And people trying to control your life and trying to tell you what you can't do. And it's all it is. It's just a bunch of rules that you can't do. Well, that's not necessarily true. And we know that. The hermits of the desert deliberately pursued as much discomfort as possible. They clothed themselves in rags. It was their boast that they never washed and that they lived in filth. It was a matter of pride to be covered with lice. And it was a matter of great exuberance for them, I guess, to have wounds covered by all manner of insects and beds infested with bugs. These hermits ate only enough to keep from starving. And they daily tortured themselves by not allowing themselves to sleep. And they did everything possible to stay away with anything that could bring joy to their life. Paschal, one of their noted hermits from the desert, went so far as to wear a sharp-pointed belt next to his body, so that if he ever felt happy, all he had to do was push in one of those spikes, and that feeling of happiness would immediately be banished by a feeling of pain. For real. That's how people saw Christianity. That's how they saw what Christians were supposed to live like. In fact, even as late as the 19th century, it was believed by some that Jesus was a grave and serious child. And that as a man, he never smiled and never laughed. These things are obviously not true. You want to know how we know that they're not true? Well, Jesus couldn't have been a gloomy person. Otherwise, children wouldn't have wanted to come to him. Otherwise, parents of those children wouldn't want Jesus to bless their children, to pray for their children. Tax collectors and sinners would have been repulsed by him instead of attracted to him. And Jesus, when he was teaching, he could use illustrations that had to bring at least a smile to the face of the people who were listening to him. I mean, when he talks about pulling the log out of your own eye so you can see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's, they had to have chuckled a little bit at that illustration. And when Jesus talks about a camel going through the eye of a needle, that's a pretty outlandish illustration. Actually, the word for camel and for a ship's hawser in the Greek are very similar. A hawser is a cable or a rope that a ship has for towing another vessel. They're so very similar, so it's really uncertain as to what Jesus is saying there. Although, if you think about it, there's no way one of those ropes is going through the eye of a needle either, okay? So don't let that diminish the point Jesus is trying to make, that with man it's impossible, but with God all things are possible. But eyebrows must have raised when he used that illustration. You know, he loved the people, and it showed. Jesus compared the kingdom to a feast. Christianity, in its essence, is a thing of joy. And we ought to show it as such. Now, here's the really important part. The kingdom is the church. The kingdom of God on the earth is the church. And the church, by the way, is not the building, okay? The church is the people. This ought to be the most joyful place on earth. Maybe not the happiest, okay? Because happiness depends on external circumstances, and sometimes external circumstances are such that it makes it difficult to be happy. But joy, real, pure joy, comes from what's inside us, from what unites us. You know, the church ought to be the most joyful place on earth. The church, and by the church again, I mean the people here, we ought to be looking for reasons to get together with them rather than for excuses not to get together. Really, we ought to. I mean, that ought to be the joy that is felt when we get together. Now, speaking of excuses, though, In the parable, Jesus says 3 of the guests offered excuses. The excuses that they offer are things that made sense to them, but they were just that. They were excuses. You want to know the difference between an excuse and a reason? An excuse attempts to remove blame. A reason justifies an act. So excuses aren't nearly as compelling as reasons, okay? So let's look at the first excuse. I have bought a field and I must go and see it. This excuse represents the person to whom business comes first. Business is what is most important to them. Now, don't misunderstand me. It is necessary to be dedicated to your job. It really is. I mean, if you're not dedicated to your job, you're going to have you're not going to do a very good job if you're not dedicated to it. You know, if your job is a plumber and you're not really dedicated to it and you really don't like being a plumber, you're not going to do a very good job, and pretty soon you're not going to be a plumber anymore. Why? Because people aren't going to call you, right? Am I right, Larry? That's how that works? Yeah. If you don't enjoy your job, you're not going to do a very good job. Now, so it's important to be devoted to your business, but not so much that everything else gets squeezed out. See, the problem with this excuse, think about it for a second. I just bought a field and I have to go look at it. They didn't exactly have photographs where they could take a picture and you could look at it beforehand. If you wanted to see a field, you had to go and look at it. Who is going to buy a field without looking at it first? It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Not to mention the fact that in all likelihood, this feast had been prepared all day, and not only that, they had notice of it a while before, but the feast had been being cooked all day, and in all likelihood, it was starting to maybe get dark when it was time for the feast. And how much good is it going to do you to go and look at a field when it's dark and there's no electricity? It's not going to do very good at all. There's always tomorrow that they could go and look at it. They didn't. In evening banquet, you wouldn't want to do that anyway. Second excuse: I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Some versions say I go to try them out. This is the person for whom novelty is their passion. The newest, latest, greatest gadget. They have to have it. They have to have anything that is new, anything that is recently happening. That's what they want to talk about. That's what they want to have. Acts chapter 17 verse 21 says, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. That's the type of person that this is talking about. They just want to talk about the latest ideas and everything. They encounter something new, and it drives everything else out of their mind. They could be having a serious, heartfelt discussion with somebody, and then they see something else happen. Oh, what's this over here? And they forget all about the discussion that they were having. This excuse also has some problems, though. Oxen would be considered major farm equipment. I never have lived on a farm. I don't know a whole lot about farming. But would anyone actually buy a major piece of farm equipment without at least looking at it, examining it first? Probably not. Yet apparently that's what this guy did. Also, remember, it's late in the day. And back in the first century, when Jesus would be telling this parable, oxen didn't come with headlights. They had horns, but not headlights. Isn't that funny? Okay. Oh, thank you. That was a nice courtesy laugh there. Anyway, the third excuse. I just married a wife, and therefore I can't come. Now, of the 3, this one sounds the most logical. Perhaps even an acceptable excuse. I just got married, so I'm going to be gone, or I've got to be out of town, or what have you. This is the person whose God is home. God, lowercase g, by the way. It is possible to take an entirely selfish view of home. Don't misunderstand me. Home is important. But we can't neglect God, big G, for our home. The great value of home is that it is a place to be refreshed. It's a place where we can go and escape the pressures of life. We can go there whenever we need to, and we can get away from everyone and everything else. Except God is always with us in our home. This excuse, I said, it sounds the most logical, possibly acceptable, but it has a problem as well. One problem is that the wife was probably invited to the feast too. Okay? It wasn't like he'd have to leave his wife behind, his new wife behind, and go to this feast all by himself. No, the wife probably was invited too. The fact that they just got married, you got to look at the difference between weddings back then versus today. You know, remember, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, that when you got married, you didn't necessarily go away for a honeymoon. You held court for a week. And people came in and celebrated with you. And so they just went through maybe a celebration of their own. And why wouldn't they want to celebrate some more? Besides all of that, even nowadays, there are two types of people who should never, ever, ever refuse a free meal. That would be college students and newlyweds. You don't ever turn down an invitation for a free meal. So anyway, all of these were good excuses to the individual. They sounded logical to the people who made them. But they all boil down to one thing. They all boil down to these people let something that is good interfere with something that is better or the best. You see, it's all about priorities. If your priorities aren't right, you're going to find excuses and excuses and excuses not to be, well, as he says here, eating bread in the kingdom of God. You know, it's good to be interested in your business and involved in your business and dedicated to your business. It's good to have new things and to experience novelty and to have that wonder of joy if you get something new. And it's important to make home life a high priority. But devotion to Jesus ought to outweigh all of it. So has something come between you and Christ? See, that's what happened here. Something came between the people who were invited and the master of the banquet. And when something comes between you and Christ, we may end up missing out on the greatest banquet of all. If something's come between you and Christ, take it out of the way. Don't use it as an excuse. See it as an excuse and say, you know what? It's an excuse. It's an attempt to remove blame. I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm going to focus on the reasons that I have to be a part of that celebration, to be a part of that banquet. The greatest reason of all is that price that was paid so that you could attend the heavenly banquet. See, it wasn't cheap. It wasn't a ticket that you could buy by yourself. It wasn't a ticket that your parents could leave to you in their will or that they could buy for you. It's a ticket that only Jesus could purchase for you. And He did with His blood. If things aren't right between you and God, why not make them right tonight? If we can help you through a public response to do that, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together?